Tonight, we follow the journey of a brave dwarven company, delving deep into the heart of Middle-earth's ancient mountains. Mount Gundabad, once a sacred site for the dwarves, has long been a place of conflict and sorrow. Now, a group of determined adventurers seeks to reclaim its forgotten halls and uncover the secrets buried within. What will they find in the shadowed depths of this mountain? Will they bring honor to their kin, or awaken a peril older than the world itself? Settle in for an hour of epic storytelling, whispered with soothing ASMR tones to transport you to Tolkien's legendary world. Like, comment, and subscribe to discover more untold tales of Middle-earth. Chapter 1. The Call to Gundabad. The great hall of Erebor shimmered under the golden glow of its vast chandeliers, which hung like inverted mountains of light. Around the stone tables, carved with the faces of dwarven kings, the finest lords and warriors of Erebor had gathered. The air hummed with anticipation, their voices a low murmur as they speculated about the purpose of this rare assembly. At the head of the hall, upon his throne of stone and steel, sat King Dain Ironfoot, his face as stern and unyielding as the granite peaks that encased his kingdom. "Silence!" bellowed a herald, striking his staff upon the stone floor. The echoes rippled through the hall, and all eyes turned toward the king. Dain stood, his heavy, silver-embroidered robes sweeping the ground as he addressed his kin. His voice carried the weight of centuries. Brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters of Durin's folk, hear me. For too long, we have turned our backs on the north. For too long, the halls of Gundabad, sacred to our people, have been left to the filth of orcs and the dust of time. No more. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Gundabad was a name that stirred both pride and pain in the hearts of the dwarves. It was said that Durin the Deathless, the father of their race, had first awoken beneath its shadow. But Gundabad had been lost for ages, first to orcs in the First Age, and later to time and forgetfulness. Dain's voice thundered again, silencing the whispers. We are stronger now than we have been in an age. Erebor thrives, our people prosper, and our axes are sharp. The time has come to reclaim what was stolen from us. Mount Gundabad will be ours again. The hall erupted into cheers, the dwarves raising their mugs and weapons in approval. Amid the clamour, two figures stood silently by the king's side. Brock Stonehelm and Thrain Copperfist, the leaders of the expedition. Brock Stonehelm, the warrior. Brock, a stout and battle-hardened warrior, wore his scars as badges of honour. His dark beard was streaked with silver, and his piercing blue eyes reflected a lifetime of conflict. For Brock, this mission was more than a call to reclaim lost heritage. It was personal. Years earlier, his kin had been slaughtered by orcs during a raid on their outpost near the Grey Mountains. The memory haunted him, and the chance to bring vengeance to Gundabad's orcish defilers filled him with grim determination. Standing by the king, Brock gripped the haft of his double-headed axe, engraved with runes of protection. His voice was steady and firm as he addressed the assembly. We do not embark on this journey lightly. Gundabad is no simple mine to be reopened. It is a fortress of stone and steel, and it will not surrender without a fight. But I swear to you, by the fire in my heart and the steel in my hands, that we will carve a path to its very core. Thrain Copperfist, the scholar. Beside Brock stood Thrain Copperfist, a dwarven scholar and lawkeeper, his robes lined with shimmering golden thread. Unlike Brock, Thrain was not known for his prowess in battle, but for his unparalleled knowledge of dwarven history and craftsmanship. Gundabad had been his obsession for decades, and the opportunity to uncover its secrets filled him with a sense of awe. Mount Gundabad is more than stone and ore, Thrain said, his voice quieter, but no less commanding. It is the cradle of our people, the resting place of Durin's legacy. Within its halls lie treasures of knowledge and craftsmanship that have been lost to time. But beware, for the deeper we delve, the closer we come to forces that have slumbered for ages. We must tread carefully, for not all of Gundabad's secrets will welcome us. His warning lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the otherwise triumphant mood. The assembly prepares. After the king's decree, the preparations for the expedition began in earnest. The finest blacksmiths of Erebor worked day and night, crafting weapons, armor, and tools imbued with protective runes. The forges blazed with life, their fires casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Brock supervised the assembly of the warriors, selecting only the most skilled and courageous. "This is no place for untested youths," he said sternly. "Only those who have faced the darkness before will accompany us." Thrain, meanwhile, consulted ancient maps and scrolls, piecing together the labyrinthine layout of Gundabad's halls and mines. He pored over accounts of previous expeditions, many of which ended in disaster. One evening, as the final preparations were underway, a wandering ranger arrived in Erebor. His weathered cloak was dusted with snow, and his eyes were sharp with the knowledge of the wilds. He spoke in hushed tones to King Dain, warning of increased orc activity near Gundabad. "They know you're coming," he said gravely. The departure. The day of the expedition's departure arrived, and the company gathered in Erebor's great gate. 50 dwarves stood ready, their armor gleaming and their faces set with determination. Among them were miners equipped with enchanted pickaxes, warriors clad in chainmail, and a handful of lorekeepers, including Thrain. Families gathered to bid their loved ones farewell, their emotions a mixture of pride and trepidation. "Bring back glory," one elder said, grasping Brock's arm, "and return to us whole." As the gates creaked open, the company began their march northward. The path to Gundabad was long and treacherous, winding through snow-laden passes and barren wastelands. Each step brought them closer to the unknown, and the weight of their mission pressed heavily on their shoulders, foreshadowing the journey ahead. As they journeyed, the dwarves passed the ruins of settlements long abandoned. The wind howled through the broken stone walls, carrying whispers of a time when their people had thrived in these lands. Brock and Thrain paused to study the remnants, their thoughts turning to the fragility of their kin's legacy. One evening, as they camped near the base of the Grey Mountains, Thrain shared a tale by the firelight. "Mount Gundabad was not merely a home," he said, his voice resonating with reverence. "It was a place of power, where the earth itself seemed alive with the essence of Durin. But power, as we know, attracts darkness." Brock frowned. "You think the orcs are the least of our worries?" Thrain hesitated before nodding. "I believe Gundabad holds more than we can imagine, and not all of it will favor our return." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on their faces. In the distance, the peak of Mount Gundabad loomed against the starlit sky, silent and foreboding. Chapter 2. The Journey North. The sun rose over the jagged peaks of the lonely mountain as the company of 50 dwarves began their march. A crisp wind carried snowflakes from the highlands, dusting the adventurers' helmets and cloaks. Erebor's gates creaked shut behind them, their metallic echo a solemn reminder of the long road ahead. For the first few days, the company traveled in relative ease. The lands immediately surrounding Erebor were well patrolled and secure. Dwarven merchants passed them occasionally, their wagons laden with iron, silver, and gems destined for trade in Dale. The march felt almost celebratory, with songs of Durin's deeds and the glory of the dwarves rising into the air. Brock Stonehelm led the company from the front, his axe slung across his broad back, while Thrain Copperfist walked among the lorekeepers near the centre, clutching a worn leather satchel filled with maps and scrolls. Thrain turned his gaze to the horizon, where the silhouette of the grey mountains rose against the sky. "The real journey begins there," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Brock, overhearing, grunted. "Aye, that's where the wilds start, and where the orcs hunt. The terrain grows harsher." By the end of the week, the terrain began to shift. The fertile plains gave way to rocky foothills and steep, snow-covered paths. The air grew colder, biting at the dwarves' exposed skin, and the songs faded as the group focused on the arduous climb. On the third night in the foothills, they made camp in the shadow of an ancient stone watchtower. It was a relic from an age when the dwarves of Gundabad ruled these lands, but now it stood crumbling and overgrown. Thrain wandered toward the base of the tower, his eyes scanning the weathered stone. "Here," he called out to Brock, who approached with a wary expression. "These runes are Kuzdul. They speak of a network of signal beacons used to warn of invasions. This tower might have been the last to fall during Gundabad's collapse." Brock studied the faint carvings, his brow furrowing. And yet it couldn't save them. Orcs poured over these lands like a tide, and we were driven south. He spat onto the ground, as if the memory itself tasted bitter. Gundabad's halls may still echo with their filth. Thrain placed a hand on the stone. Not all of Gundabad's secrets have been taken by orcs. The deeper halls remain untouched, places where even they fear to tread. Encounter at the frozen river. 2 days later, the company came upon a wide, frozen river. The ice sparkled in the pale sunlight, thick and treacherous. They began to cross cautiously, their boots crunching against the frosty surface. Halfway across, Brock halted, raising a hand to signal the others. "Hold," he said, his voice low and tense. "Something's wrong." At the edge of the river, barely visible beneath the ice, lay the frozen form of a troll. Its massive limbs were encased in ice, its mouth agape in a frozen snarl. "By Durin's beard," one of the dwarves whispered. "How did it get trapped like that?" "Not by natural means," Thrain replied, his eyes narrowing. "This is old magic. Best we move quickly." As if in response to his words, the ice beneath their feet began to crack. The troll's eyes snapped open, and it let out a guttural roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. The company sprang into action as the troll broke free from its icy prison. Weapons clashed against its thick hide, and dwarves scrambled to avoid its massive fists. Brock led the charge, striking a deep wound in the creature's side with his axe. After a fierce battle, the troll collapsed with a thunderous crash, its blood steaming against the frozen ground. The company stood panting, their breath visible in the cold air. "That was no ordinary troll," Brock said, wiping blood from his axe. "Something foul stirs in these lands." Campfire Tales. That evening, as the company rested in a sheltered grove, they gathered around the fire to warm themselves and share stories. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Thrain cleared his throat and began. Gundabad was not always a place of war and darkness. Before it fell, it was a city of wonder, filled with forges that burned brighter than the stars. It is said that Durin himself walked those halls, his hammer forging the first weapons of our people. One of the younger dwarves, a miner named Barth, leaned forward. "Do you believe the forges still burn?" Thrain hesitated, then nodded. "Perhaps. But there are other things that may dwell there. things older than orcs, older than the dwarves themselves. The company fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them like the cold night air. Signs of orc activity. The next morning, the group discovered tracks in the snow. Brock knelt to examine them, his expression grim. "Orcs," he muttered, "and fresh ones at that. They know we're here." The company pressed on with renewed vigilance. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the tracks became more frequent. They found abandoned campsites, the embers of fires still warm. One of the scouts, a wiry dwarf named Dorley, returned with troubling news. "A band of orcs is camped ahead, near the pass," he reported. "They're waiting for us." The ambush. Brock wasted no time organizing a counter-ambush. He split the company into two groups. One would feign retreat, drawing the orcs into the open, while the other would flank them. The plan worked. As the orcs charged down the pass, roaring in anticipation of an easy kill, they were met by a wall of dwarves. The battle was fierce and chaotic, the clash of steel echoing through the mountains. Brock fought like a warrior possessed, his axe cleaving through orc shields and armor. Thrain, though less skilled in combat, used his knowledge of the terrain to guide his comrades and block the orcs' retreat. By the time the sun set, the pass was littered with the bodies of the fallen. The dwarves had emerged victorious, but not without cost. Several of their number lay wounded, and the toll of the journey was beginning to show. Reaching the foot of Gundabad. At last, after weeks of travel, the company reached the base of Mount Gundabad. The mountain loomed above them, its jagged peak shrouded in mist. The sight filled them with a mixture of awe and dread. Brock turned to address the company. "We've come this far, and there's no turning back. Gundabad awaits. Steel your hearts, for the hardest part of our journey lies ahead." Thrain placed a hand on the cold stone of the mountain's base, his expression contemplative. This is where legends are born, or where they end. The company set up camp, their eyes fixed on the darkened peak above. The shadow of Gundabad stretched long over them, a silent reminder of the trials yet to come. Chapter 3. The Descent into Gundabad. As the first light of dawn broke over Mount Gundabad, the dwarves stood at the foot of the great peak, preparing for what would surely be the most perilous part of their journey. The mountain loomed before them, its jagged rocks and sheer cliffs seeming impenetrable. The snow-covered ground crunched underfoot as they set their sights on the entrance to the ancient stronghold, a narrow, winding path carved into the rock, guarded by the remnants of dwarven stonework. Brock Stonehelm led the way, his axe resting heavily on his shoulder. His eyes scanned the surroundings with practiced wariness, searching for any signs of danger. The air was still, save for the faint wind that howled through the cracks in the mountain's surface. It felt as though the very mountain itself was watching them, its stony heart silent and waiting. Behind him, Thrain Copperfist lingered, his thoughts more on the ancient halls hidden within than on the dangers lurking outside. "This place," Thrain said softly, "was once the crown jewel of our people, the greatest halls of Durin. It was here that our ancestors carved their legacy into the very bones of the earth." Brock gave a low grunt of acknowledgement, but said nothing. His focus was elsewhere. They all knew that Gundabad had been lost, overrun by orcs and other dark creatures. Reclaiming it would not be as simple as reclaiming a home. It would be a fight for survival. The path into darkness. As the company advanced, the path grew steeper. The stone underfoot turned slick with ice, and the snow, now thicker and heavier, began to fall faster, swirling in the wind. Every few steps, one of the dwarves would pause, casting a wary glance behind them. It felt as if the mountain itself was alive with danger, but they pressed on, driven by the need to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Eventually, the narrow pass opened up into a wide gorge, its walls rising steeply on either side. Thrain stopped to examine the stonework of the ancient dwarven carvings that decorated the edges of the gorge. "These halls were once a place of industry and culture," he said, tracing his fingers over the smooth, faded stone. "Here, our ancestors forged weapons of incredible power, but they also forged their downfall." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed across the gorge, followed by the sound of stone grinding against stone. Thrain turned to see a massive rock slide careening down the side of the gorge, blocking the path ahead. It came to a halt just a few feet from where they stood, and the dwarves froze in shock, their hearts racing. "Ambush!" Brock snarled. "They've known we were coming." The first orc attack. As if on cue, the sound of marching boots echoed from the far side of the gorge. Dark shapes appeared at the top of the cliffs, orc archers silhouetted against the grey sky. Brock raised his axe, motioning for the company to spread out into defensive positions. "We fight! Hold your ground!" Brock shouted. Arrows flew toward them, and the dwarves swiftly raised their shields to deflect the barrage. The air was filled with the sound of metal clanging against metal as they closed ranks, forming a protective barrier. Thrain, his heart pounding in his chest, scanned the surroundings for the best course of action. He could see a narrow passage just behind them, a potential escape route if the ambush became too overwhelming. But they couldn't retreat. Not yet. One of the orcs leapt down from the cliffs, landing heavily in front of Brock, its jagged sword raised. With a swift motion, Brock swung his axe, striking the orc's blade and shattering it. The orc let out a screech of rage and lunged forward, but Brock was faster. With a powerful strike, he cleaved the orc in two. The battle raged on, the clash of steel filling the air. Dwarves and orcs alike fought fiercely, each side determined to claim the pass. Thrain stood back, directing his fellow dwarves to hold the line. "We cannot allow them to breach the pass," he said to his closest companions. "If they force us back into the gorge, we'll be trapped." After what seemed like hours, the orcs finally began to retreat, their numbers dwindling in the face of the dwarves' unyielding defense. But as the last of the attackers fell, Thrain could not shake the feeling that something far darker awaited them within the mountain. Into the ancient halls. With the immediate threat vanquished, the dwarves regrouped and continued their march into the heart of Gundabad. The path grew narrower still, the stone walls of the gorge closing in as they neared the entrance to the mountain's depths. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence fell over the company. At last, they reached the massive stone doors of the ancient gates of Gundabad, doors that had once been wide and inviting, now sealed shut by centuries of neglect. Thrain stepped forward, inspecting the massive runes carved into the stone. "These runes," Thrain murmured, "are not of the same style as those at Erebor. They speak of a pact made long ago, between Durin and the spirits of the mountain. These doors were meant to remain closed, but..." His voice trailed off as he studied the broken seals. "Someone has tampered with them." Brock took out his axe and swung it at the stone door, testing its strength. The first blow reverberated through the ground, but the door didn't budge. He swung again, harder this time, and with a thunderous crash. The door cracked open just enough for them to squeeze through. The dwarves gathered at the entrance, their torches casting long shadows on the walls of the first chamber. As they entered, a deep chill filled the air, and the unmistakable smell of decay and neglect reached their nostrils. The halls of Gundabad were as silent as a tomb. Thrain stood at the threshold, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "We've entered the heart of the mountain," he said. "Now we must see what remains of our ancestors." Exploring the lower halls. The dwarves ventured deeper into the halls of Gundabad. The stone walls were covered with centuries of dust, and the once glorious forges now lay silent and empty. Thrain's heart ached as he moved through the abandoned chambers, each one a ghost of what it had once been. "The heart of the forges," Thrain said softly, touching the cold stone where great fires once roared. "Here, we shaped not only weapons but the very destiny of our people." Brock paused and scanned the surroundings, his keen senses alert for any movement. This place is cursed. There's something wrong here. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the air grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Suddenly, a distant rumble echoed through the stone corridors. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and dust fell from the ceiling. "What was that?" one of the dwarves asked nervously. "I don't know," Brock replied, gripping his axe. "But I don't think it's a welcoming party." Conclusion of Chapter 3. The dwarves stood in the heart of Gundabad, unsure of what awaited them in the depths of their ancestors' great halls. They had fought their way past orc ambushes, broken ancient seals, and descended into the darkness. Yet the true challenge of reclaiming Gundabad had only just begun. As the company gathered their strength and prepared to delve deeper into the forsaken halls, the question remained: would they find the treasures and glory of their ancestors, or would they fall victim to the dark forces that had claimed Gundabad for themselves? The journey had only just begun, and the true battle for Gundabad was about to unfold. Chapter 4. The Hall of Echoes. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the abandoned halls of Gundabad as the dwarves moved deeper into the mountain's heart. Their lanterns cast flickering light against the towering stone walls, revealing intricate carvings of forgotten history, ancient depictions of dwarves at work, their mighty forges alight, and battles fought in the shadow of Gundabad's great halls. Yet, despite the grandeur that these chambers must have once held, a heavy silence pressed in on them like a weight. Brock Stonehelm led the way, his every step cautious as his keen eyes scanned the surrounding darkness. He had led many expeditions in his day, but this place felt different, darker. Something in the air, thick with centuries of dust and decay, stirred the instincts of every dwarf in the company. They were not alone. Thrain Copperfist walked a few steps behind, his thoughts weighed down by the history that clung to this forsaken place. Gundabad had once been a seat of dwarven power, the stronghold from which their ancestors had commanded vast armies, built fortresses, and forged weapons that had withstood the test of time. But the ruins before them, those half hidden in shadows, whispered of something else. A fall that was not only physical, but spiritual. "These halls," Thrain muttered, his voice carrying through the stillness, "hold secrets older than any of us. I wonder what caused our ancestors to abandon this place." "Maybe it wasn't them who abandoned it," Brock replied grimly, his gaze fixed on the narrowing passage ahead. "Maybe they were driven out." The first clue. The company came upon a large chamber, its ceiling high and vaulted, the stonework still impressive despite the ravages of time. But the walls were marked by something else entirely, runes that had been scratched and carved hastily into the surface, clearly not made by the skilled hands of dwarven masons. Thrain approached the wall cautiously, his fingers tracing the strange markings. The language was unfamiliar, but the script had a cruel, jagged quality to it, nothing like the graceful runes of Kuzdul. His brow furrowed. "These aren't dwarven," Thrain whispered. "These are..." something else. Brock stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the writing. Could be Orcish, or something worse. Look at the markings. They're recent, fresh. The dwarves exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared speak the thought aloud, but they all shared it. Orcs had been the downfall of Gundabad. But was it only orcs? Or had something darker taken root here long ago? The heart of the hall. Thrain and Brock motioned for the company to move forward, the tension in the air palpable as they descended deeper into the mountain. They passed through narrower corridors, each one feeling more oppressive than the last. At last, they reached a massive archway, its grandeur still apparent despite the centuries of neglect. Beyond it lay the largest hall they had yet encountered, and the sense of unease only deepened as they crossed the threshold. The floor was uneven, pitted with age and debris, and there were no lights here, no torches on the walls to indicate that this chamber had ever been visited by anyone but the most desperate and daring. But what drew their attention was the center of the room. There, illuminated by the flickering light of their lanterns, stood a massive stone pedestal. Upon it rested an object, wrapped in tattered cloth. The air around it felt thick, as though it had absorbed the very essence of the mountain, of years of abandonment and whispered rumors. Brock stepped forward cautiously, his hand tightening around his axe, his eyes never leaving the pedestal. "What is that?" he muttered. Thrain moved closer, his heart racing. "It's an artifact," he said slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "A relic from the ancient days of Gundabad." With a swift motion, Thrain pulled away the cloth, revealing a large, intricately forged hammer. The handle was made of dark wood, gnarled and twisted, while the head was wrought from a rare, gleaming metal that shimmered even in the dim light. "This," Thrain breathed, "this is a weapon of immense power. It's one of the legendary hammers forged by Durin's smiths, lost to time." But as he gazed at it, a chill ran through his spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the weapon, something that made the air grow colder, the shadows darker. "We must be careful," Thrain warned. "This is not just a weapon. It's a symbol of what was lost. Something terrible happened here, and this hammer may be the key to understanding it." The whispering shadows. As the company gathered around the pedestal, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air thickened. The whispers began. It started as a low murmur, barely perceptible over the sound of the dwarves breathing. But then, as they strained to listen, the voices grew louder, soft, distorted murmurs that came from the very stone walls. Words seemed to form, but they weren't in Khuzdul. They were foreign, ancient, filled with malice. One of the dwarves, a young warrior named Dromar, stepped back from the pedestal, his eyes wide with fear. "What is that sound?" he gasped. Brock grabbed his arm, pulling him closer. "Stay focused, lad. Don't listen to the shadows." But the whispers continued, growing in volume. The dwarf nearest the pedestal, an older dwarf named Bala, stepped forward, his eyes glazed over, as if drawn into some trance. "The shadows speak," Bala murmured. "They seek freedom. They hunger." Thrain reached out, grabbing Bala by the shoulder and shaking him roughly. "Snap out of it, Bala!" he commanded. But it was too late. The dwarf fell silent, his face pale and empty. And then, without warning, a massive gust of wind erupted from the chamber's dark recesses, extinguishing the dwarves' lanterns in an instant. The room plunged into total darkness, and the whispers turned into shrieks, as though the mountain itself were alive with a terrible hunger. The unseen enemy. The dwarves quickly drew their weapons, the darkness around them now oppressive and suffocating. Brock could feel the shift in the air. Something was moving within the blackness. He had been in countless battles, but this was different. Thrain's voice rang out, commanding the dwarves to form a tight circle. "Stay close, keep your shields up, and watch your backs," he shouted. The sounds of claws scraping against stone echoed from all directions, and the hairs on the back of every dwarf's neck stood on end. Then, from the corners of the room, glowing red eyes appeared. Small at first, but growing larger and more numerous by the second. Brock's heart pounded in his chest as the first shadowy figure lunged at him, slashing with claws and teeth. With a roar, he swung his axe and struck it down, but the creature was only one of many. The dwarves fought valiantly, but the number of their foes seemed endless. The creatures, they were not orcs, nor trolls, nor anything the dwarves had encountered before. Their forms were twisted, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of rage. The only thing that was certain was that they were ancient, and they were hungry for vengeance. The hammer's curse. As the battle raged, Thrain realized with horror that the creatures were not attacking randomly. They were focused on the hammer, the relic he had uncovered. "They want it!" Thrain shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "We must leave it!" Brock turned to Thrain, his face grim. "We can't leave it. Not after we've come this far." Thrain's eyes flashed with a mix of resolve and fear. The hammer is cursed. It draws them here. It is a beacon for the shadow. The company, bloodied and battered, hesitated. The hammer, now glowing faintly with a sinister light, seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the mountain itself. They had no choice but to destroy it, before it consumed them all. With a final rallying cry, Brock swung his axe at the pedestal, shattering the stone beneath the hammer. But as the weapon fell, the ground trembled violently. The creatures howled in fury, their eyes burning like embers in the darkness. Conclusion of Chapter 4. With the destruction of the hammer, the shadows seemed to recoil, retreating into the cracks of Gundabad's walls. But the danger was far from over. The company had stirred something ancient, something that had long lain dormant in the depths of the mountain. Thrain stood over the shattered remnants of the pedestal, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The Hall of Gundabad had become a place of great power and unspeakable darkness. They had barely survived the encounter, and yet the true depths of the curse that lay on this forsaken mountain were still unknown. The dwarves would have to press forward, for their journey was far from over, and the horrors of Gundabad were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Chapter 5. The Forsaken Tombs. The silence that followed the destruction of the hammer was not a comfort. The shadows seemed to linger, stretching and curling like tendrils through the mountain's darkened halls. Brock Stonehelm stood at the edge of the room, his eyes narrowed, ever watchful. The dwarves had fought hard, but the true nature of the danger had only just begun to reveal itself. They were no longer sure whether they had disturbed the mountain's forgotten secrets, or awakened something much darker. Thrain Copperfist wiped the sweat and grime from his brow, his face grim. He had been in many battles, but there was something unnerving about this place. Gundabad wasn't just a ruined kingdom, it was a tomb, and its dead were stirring. "Get a move on, lads," Brock commanded, his voice harsh. "We've cleared the chamber, but we've still got to find a way out of this mess." He glanced at Thrain. "You said there were more halls below, right?" Thrain nodded, his mind distant, still processing the strange occurrence. "Yes, there's a passage below this hall, deeper into the mountain. The dwarves who first established Gundabad built tombs there. They were intended to house the great kings and heroes of our people." "Great," Brock muttered. I'm sure we'll find a party waiting for us there too. With the company on edge, they began their descent into the lower halls. The air grew colder with each step, and a sense of unease washed over them. It was as though the very stone they walked upon was alive, breathing with the weight of ancient memories, waiting for something. But what? The tomb of Durin's heir. The passageway led them deeper into Gundabad's bowels, the stone narrowing with every step. They passed numerous alcoves, most of them empty but for the dust of ages. But one alcove caught their attention. A massive door, intricately carved with symbols of Durin's line. "This is it," Thrain whispered, his voice filled with reverence. "The tomb of Durin's heir, the one who was meant to rule after the great king. His remains must be here." Brock stepped forward, inspecting the door. It was locked, but the design was familiar to him. With a grunt, he placed his hand on the stone and pressed against it, causing it to shift slightly, revealing an ancient inscription beneath the carvings. "The last king of Gundabad," Thrain murmured, reading the inscription aloud. "In death, he shall keep the mountain's secrets, forever." The door groaned, a low, terrible sound, before it finally gave way, revealing the tomb within. The chamber beyond was magnificent, despite the years of decay. Stone statues of dwarven warriors lined the walls, each holding a weapon of ancient make. At the center of the room stood a massive stone sarcophagus, encrusted with jewels and runes. This was the final resting place of Durin's heir, the ruler who had once stood in Gundabad's greatest halls. But there was something wrong. The air felt thick with magic, and the shadowed corners of the room seemed to pulse with an ominous presence. Thrain stepped closer to the sarcophagus, his heart pounding. "This tomb is not like others," he muttered. "It has been disturbed." The awakening. Suddenly, the stone floor beneath their feet began to shake violently. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling as the dwarves scrambled to keep their footing. Brock gripped his axe tightly, preparing for an attack that he knew was inevitable. They had disturbed something that had lain undisturbed for centuries. A low, grinding noise reverberated from the sarcophagus, and with a shudder, it began to open. The dwarves stood frozen as the stone lid cracked open, revealing a form cloaked in shadows. The figure inside was a giant, larger than any dwarf. His beard, once a glorious mane of braided silver, was now a tangled mess of decay. His eyes, dark and unblinking, glowed with an eerie light. This was no ordinary king. This was Durin's heir, cursed in death, bound to the mountain by a dark pact. "I am no king," the figure spoke in a voice like stone grinding against stone, "but the one who guards the secrets of Gundabad." Thrain's heart sank. "You were the king," he whispered. "What happened to you? Why are you bound here?" The figure's hollow gaze turned to Thrain, and for a moment the room fell deathly silent. Then the voice spoke again. "I was betrayed, forgotten. My soul was bound to this tomb, and now you have disturbed it." The curse of Gundabad. With a guttural cry, the creature rose from the sarcophagus, its enormous form towering over the dwarves. It was a wretched thing, its body rotting but held together by dark magic. Its eyes burned with the fury of the betrayed, and its movements were fluid despite its grotesque appearance. A massive rusted axe was clutched in its skeletal hand, the weapon crackling with an energy that seemed to warp the very air around it. Thrain and Brock exchanged a glance, and without a word, they stepped forward, readying their weapons. The battle was not just for survival now, It was for the fate of Gundabad itself. "Stay sharp, lads!" Brock shouted. "This is no ordinary foe." The cursed king roared and swung his axe, sending a wave of energy through the chamber. The dwarves scrambled to avoid the deadly blow, but the force of it shattered the stone floor beneath their feet. Thrain and Brock charged forward, axes raised high. Their weapons clashed against the creature's rusted blade, sending sparks flying into the air. For a moment, it seemed like they were evenly matched, but the king's strength was unimaginable, enhanced by the dark magic that bound him to the mountain. He swung his axe in a wide arc, knocking Brock back and sending Thrain reeling across the room. Thrain's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to regain his footing. The cursed king's eyes locked onto him with a predatory gleam. "You will pay for your trespass," it hissed. But Thrain was no stranger to danger. Summoning all his strength, he lunged forward, his axe slicing through the air. With a cry, he struck the king's weapon, sending it flying across the room. The curse that bound the creature faltered, and the king let out a terrible scream. The final blow. Realizing that the king's magic was tied to the weapon, Thrain and Brock acted quickly. Brock swung his axe at the cursed king's exposed neck, but it was Thrain who delivered the final blow. With a flash of steel, Thrain plunged his axe into the king's chest, shattering the dark magic that held the creature together. The cursed king let out one final deafening cry before his form collapsed into a pile of dust, his body disintegrating into the wind. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the dwarves could breathe freely again. The legacy of Gundabad. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded, the dwarves stood in the aftermath of their struggle. Thrain wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed the empty chamber. The creature that had once been Durin's heir was gone, and with it, the curse that had bound him to this place. But Thrain knew the battle was far from over. Gundabad had been home to countless dwarves, and its legacy was not just one of glory and strength, but also of darkness and betrayal. And even though they had defeated one evil, there was no telling what else remained hidden in the shadows of the mountain. "Let's move on," Brock said, his voice low and steady. "There are more halls to explore, more dangers to face. Gundabad isn't done with us yet." With heavy hearts but unwavering resolve, the dwarves continued their journey, the spectre of their past still looming over them. Conclusion of Chapter 5. The Forsaken Tombs. The dwarves had faced a great evil in the depths of Gundabad's tombs, an ancient curse that had taken the form of Durin's heir, a king betrayed by his own people, but their victory was only a brief reprieve. The dark magic that had bound the creature to the mountain still lingered, and the secrets of Gundabad's past were far from fully revealed. As they journeyed deeper into the mountain's heart, Thrain knew that the true danger had yet to show itself. The ancient halls of Gundabad had been built with a purpose, but now they were nothing but a tomb that still held the dark legacy of those who had come before them. With each step forward, the dwarves drew closer to uncovering the final mystery of Gundabad, and the ultimate price they would have to pay for its secrets. This is Chapter 5, The Forsaken Tombs, continuing the journey with new dangers and revelations. Chapter 6, The Forges of Gundabad. The dark shadows of Gundabad seemed to stretch endlessly before the dwarves, and as they ventured deeper into the mountain's vast belly, the air grew heavier with each passing step. The once proud halls of the dwarves had been swallowed by time, but they were still infused with a strange power. It was as if the very stone had memories of its glory days, of the songs and laughter of its makers, and of the fires that once blazed so brightly in the ancient forges. But now, the heat was gone, and in its place was an oppressive cold. A cold that seeped into their bones and made every corner of the mountain feel haunted. Brock Stonehelm led the way, his axe held steady as his gaze never wavered from the path ahead. He had fought many battles in his life, but this place, Gundabad, was different. There was something ancient here, something that reached deep into the heart of the mountain. He had sensed it when they first entered the ruined halls, and now, as they descended further into the dark depths, the feeling had only grown stronger. "This place feels alive," Brock muttered, glancing back at the company. "And not in a good way." Thrain Copperfist nodded in agreement, his thoughts preoccupied with the mountain's history. "Gundabad was once home to the greatest forges our people ever built," he said, his voice low with reverence. "Weapons forged here were the envy of every kingdom. But now, it seems that even the fires of our past have died." As they ventured deeper into the heart of the mountain, the temperature steadily dropped and the air thickened. They could smell the scent of rust and decay in the wind, and the faint sound of distant grinding echoed through the halls like the whispers of ghosts. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that weighed heavily on their minds. It was the fact that they had yet to find any sign of the ancient forges, despite traveling for hours through the maze of passageways. Gundabad had been known for its smiths, its vast ironworks, and its legendary forges that could shape the strongest steel. Surely, they must be near them now. Then, just as their hope began to wane, they rounded a corner, and there it was, a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in the shadows. At its center stood a forge, though it was no longer alight. The hearth was cold, its once glowing embers now dark and lifeless, but it was still magnificent. Massive anvils lay scattered about, and the remnants of great hammers and tongs littered the floor. The smell of burned metal and ancient smoke still clung to the air. Thrain approached the forge cautiously, kneeling to touch the cool stone of the hearth. "This is it," he said softly. "The forge of Gundabad, the heart of the mountain." Brock stepped forward, his eyes scanning the forge. "But where are the smiths? Where's the fire? Why is it cold?" Thrain's gaze hardened as he rose to his feet. "Something happened here. The forges were shut down for a reason, and I have a feeling we're about to find out what." The shattered legacy. As the dwarves examined the forge, they discovered remnants of what appeared to be unfinished weapons. Blades, axes, and shields, each more beautiful and finely crafted than the last. But there was a strange, almost eerie quality to them, as if they had been abandoned in haste, as though the smiths had left them mid-work. Suddenly, Dromar, the youngest of the dwarves, spotted something glimmering near the far wall of the forge chamber. He hurried over, his boots clanging against the stone floor, and reached down to pick up a small, gleaming stone. It was black as night, but it seemed to absorb the light from their torches, casting a strange aura of darkness around it. "Thrain!" Dromar called out, his voice trembling. "What is this?" Thrain stepped over, his brow furrowed as he took the stone from Dromar's hand. It was unlike anything he had seen before, a smooth, obsidian-like gem that pulsed faintly with an inner light. He could feel the weight of it in his hands, as though the stone carried a presence all its own. "This is no ordinary stone," Thrain said quietly. "It's a relic, one that has been touched by dark magic. This must be what the dwarves were trying to forge here." Brock's expression grew darker. "A cursed relic forged in the very heart of Gundabad. I don't like where this is going." Thrain studied the stone, his mind racing. "This is not just any artifact. This is one of the lost stones, the very ones that were used to bind dark power in the ancient days. These stones were said to have the ability to corrupt and twist the minds of those who sought to use them. Dromar shuddered at the thought. Then what happened to the smiths? Why were they abandoned? Thrain turned to face the chamber once more, his eyes narrowing. The forge was never just a place for weapons. It was a place of great power, one that drew those with ambition and greed. I believe that the stone was the catalyst. Some smiths sought to use it for their own purposes, to craft weapons of unimaginable power. But in doing so, they brought ruin upon themselves. Brock's voice cut through the tension. The forge was abandoned because of this stone, wasn't it? The dwarves must have been driven mad, trying to master something they shouldn't have. Yes, Thrain replied gravely. The stones are cursed, and the mountain itself knows it. It has rejected the forge's fire, for it knows what was created here. The awakening of the forge. As they stood there, contemplating the history of Gundabad's downfall, a faint tremor suddenly shook the ground beneath their feet. The air grew colder, and the sound of grinding metal echoed once more through the chamber. But this time it wasn't a distant noise. It was coming from deep within the forge itself. Dromar took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Brock gripped his axe, his gaze never leaving the forge. "Get ready, everyone. I don't like this one bit." The forge itself began to rumble, and the embers in the hearth flickered with a sickly light. The stone around them cracked as if something ancient was stirring beneath the surface. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the hearth, tall and imposing, wrapped in flames, its form forged from molten metal and shadow. "I am the forged king," the figure boomed in a voice that reverberated through the chamber. "The one who was bound to the forge's fire. I am the will of Gundabad's creators, and I shall rise again." The dwarves stood frozen, watching in horror as the figure fully emerged, its molten body glistening in the dim light. It was a grotesque sight. Its body was made of metal and flame, but its face was twisted, its features warped by the corruption of the stone. The forged king was no king at all. It was a creature of fire and madness, created by the very same dark forces that had twisted the fate of the smiths. The battle for Gundabad's soul. The forged king lifted its arms, summoning a blast of fiery energy that sent the dwarves scattering to avoid the scorching flames. "You dare disturb my slumber?" it hissed. "You dare trespass in my kingdom?" Brock was the first to recover, charging forward with his axe raised high. He struck the creature's molten body with all his might, but his blade merely glanced off, leaving no mark on the fire-forged monstrosity. Thrain, knowing that brute force alone would not defeat this creature, quickly scanned the room for any possible weakness. His eyes landed on the stone that Dromar had picked up earlier, the lost stone. It seemed to pulse with energy, its darkness swirling around it. "That's it!" Thrain shouted. "The stone! The stone is its source of power!" Brock nodded, understanding the plan instantly. "We'll need to destroy it before it destroys us." With no time to waste, Thrain charged towards the creature, evading its fiery blasts, while Brock leapt into action, striking at the forged king's limbs in an attempt to weaken it. Conclusion of Chapter 6. The Forges of Gundabad. In the heart of the forge, the dwarves fought not only for their lives, but for the very soul of Gundabad. The forged king, a monstrous creation of molten metal and dark magic, was a remnant of the forge's cursed past. But the dwarves had a single hope, the lost stone that held the key to the creature's power. With their weapons and determination, the battle for the forge's future had begun. Chapter 6. The Forges of Gundabad has set the stage for a thrilling battle between the dwarves and a terrifying creation. The ancient forge, once a symbol of dwarven greatness, has now become a battleground. Chapter 7. The Curse of the Forge. The heat from the forge was still fresh in their minds as the dwarves stood in the ruins of the once glorious hall. They had faced the forged king, a creature of fire and darkness born of ancient magic, and though they had struck the monster down, it was clear that the true threat of Gundabad had not been fully revealed. Thrain Copperfist felt the weight of that truth press heavily on his shoulders. "That thing was no mere guardian," Thrain said, his voice steady despite the toll of the battle. "It was a creation, a weapon born of the very magic that corrupted this place." Brock Stonehelm, his armor scorched from the creature's flames, nodded grimly. "A weapon that has been lying dormant in this mountain for who knows how long. And now, it's been awakened." Dromar, still holding the cursed lost stone, shuddered. But what caused it to come alive? Was it the stone? Was it our presence here? "It was the forge," Thrain answered. "The forge itself is a part of Gundabad. It is tied to the soul of the mountain. And that relic, the stone, is what holds the key to the curse that binds this place. We've only scratched the surface of what Gundabad truly is." As they gathered around the remnants of the forge, Thrain's mind raced. What they had encountered was only the beginning. They had witnessed the power of the lost stone, but it was clear that the curse of Gundabad was far from lifted. There was more to uncover, darker secrets hidden deep beneath the mountain's surface. The unseen depths. The dwarves, shaken but determined, pressed on, following the winding passages that led deeper into the heart of Gundabad. The further they descended, the colder it became. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient dust. But there was something else, a strange magnetic pull that seemed to draw them toward the deeper halls. "We're getting closer," Thrain said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This path leads to the inner sanctum. It's said that the deepest halls of Gundabad hold the true heart of the mountain, its power, its riches, and its curse." "Power and riches," Brock muttered. "Those sound like the things that got the dwarves in trouble here to begin with." Dromar, who had remained quiet for most of the journey, finally spoke up. "Do you think the lost stone will help us? Or do you think it's the cause of all this?" Thrain paused, considering the question. "The stone is the key to understanding the curse. It's tied to the creation of the forge, and it's likely that its presence in this place is what twisted the very essence of Gundabad. But until we reach the heart of the mountain, we won't know for sure." As they rounded a bend, the narrow passageway opened into a massive chamber, larger than any they had seen before. The air was thick with the sense of ancient power, and a strange hum filled the silence. The chamber was lined with towering statues, each one depicting a dwarven king or warrior of old, their faces carved with expressions of stern pride. At the center of the room stood a great stone altar, cracked and weathered with age. A faint, eerie glow emanated from beneath it, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. "This is it," Thrain whispered, his heart racing. "The heart of Gundabad. The altar of the mountain's heart." The altar was ancient, its design similar to those used in the forging of powerful artifacts in the days of old. Thrain approached it cautiously, his hand reaching out toward the faint glow beneath its surface. As his fingers brushed the stone, a jolt of energy surged through him, and he stumbled back, shaking his head. "Careful," Brock warned. "This place feels like it's alive." Thrain nodded, taking a step back to survey the altar. "I think the heart of Gundabad is more than just a place. It's a force, a spirit that dwells within this mountain, and we've awoken it." Dromar, still clutching the lost stone, stepped forward cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Thrain closed his eyes, focusing on the hum that resonated through the chamber. We need to find out what this force is, and how to control it. The lost stone is linked to it somehow, but there's something more we need to understand. As he stepped closer to the altar, the ground beneath them shook violently. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the stone walls. "Who dares disturb the heart of Gundabad?" The dwarves stood frozen, their hearts pounding as the voice echoed again, louder this time. It was a deep, primal voice, filled with centuries of anger and despair. "I am the spirit of this mountain," the voice continued. "I am the forge that never dies. I am the fire that consumes all who seek to control me. The spirit of Gundabad." A dark mist began to swirl around the altar, rising from the cracks in the stone and coiling around the statues of the ancient kings. The air grew heavier, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as if the mountain itself was awakening from a long slumber. "The spirit of Gundabad," Thrain murmured. "This is what I feared. The curse that haunts this mountain isn't just a curse. It's the wrath of the very mountain itself, and it has been waiting for centuries to be freed." "Free?" Brock spat. "We've been walking into a trap from the beginning, haven't we?" Thrain's face was grim as he looked up at the swirling mist. Not a trap, an awakening. The spirit of this mountain has been bound for ages, and now it seeks a way out. But it can't escape on its own. It needs something. It needs the lost stone. Dromar stepped back, clutching the stone to his chest. "You mean, it wants the stone? It wants to use it?" Thrain nodded. "Yes, the lost stone is a conduit. It can channel the power of the spirit. If we allow it to merge with the spirit of Gundabad, it will consume the mountain and everything in its path." Brock tightened his grip on his axe. "Then we can't let it happen." But as the mist thickened, the temperature in the chamber dropped even further. The dwarves could feel the power in the air, an overwhelming, suffocating force that threatened to crush them. The statues of the kings began to shift, their stone faces twisting into expressions of rage. The spirit was no longer just a voice. It was real, and it was beginning to manifest. The final choice. Thrain looked at the lost stone in Dromar's hand, his mind racing. The stone was the key, and it was the only thing that could stop the spirit of Gundabad. But using it was dangerous. Too dangerous. Even Thrain, seasoned by countless battles and ancient lore, could feel the pull of the stone's dark power. He knew that to wield it was to risk being consumed by the very force they sought to control. "We have one choice," Thrain said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We destroy the stone. We sever the connection between the spirit and the mountain, or it will destroy us all." "But how?" Brock asked, his voice edged with fear. Thrain's eyes narrowed. "We have no choice but to destroy the altar and the stone together. We must sever the connection, or we risk unleashing a force that will consume this entire mountain." Brock nodded grimly. "Then let's do it." With the decision made, the dwarves moved as one, their resolve hardening. The heart of Gundabad was not just a place. It was a power, and the lost stone was its key. Together, they would end this, or they would be consumed by it. Conclusion of Chapter 7. The Curse of the Forge. The dwarves had come to the heart of Gundabad, only to awaken the spirit that resided within the mountain itself. The lost stone, a cursed relic tied to the very fabric of Gundabad, had the power to channel the spirit's rage and destruction. In the face of this unimaginable power, the dwarves were forced to make a dangerous decision, to destroy the stone and sever the spirit's hold on the mountain, or risk everything. The battle for Gundabad's soul had just begun. Chapter 7. The curse of the forge has set the stage for a perilous battle against the spirit of the mountain. The dwarves now face the greatest choice of their journey, whether to destroy the stone and the spirit, or risk being consumed by its power. Chapter 8. The Battle of the Lost Stone. The oppressive silence that had followed the spirit's revelation in the heart of Gundabad was shattered by a sudden, deafening roar. The mist, thick and menacing, spiraled and coiled violently, as if reacting to the dwarves' decision to defy the spirit's will. The statues of ancient dwarven kings now glowed with an eerie, ghostly light, their stone eyes twisted in anger, as though the very guardians of Gundabad had been awakened to defend the mountain's curse. Brock Stonehelm tightened his grip on his axe, his breath coming in sharp, controlled gasps as the temperature in the chamber plummeted even further. His heart beat rapidly as the air grew suffocating, the weight of the spirit's power pressing down on them like 1,000 tons of stone. "We need to act quickly," Thrain Copperfist shouted, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "We must destroy the stone, or Gundabad's spirit will consume us all." Dromar, still clutching the lost stone in his trembling hands, turned to Thrain, fear and determination warring in his eyes. "But how? How do we destroy it? It's too powerful. We don't even know what it truly is." Thrain's eyes flashed with resolve as he pointed to the altar, the faint glow beneath it growing stronger with each passing moment. "The altar is the focal point of the curse. If we destroy the stone and the altar together, we can break the bond that ties the spirit to this place. But it will not be easy. The spirit of Gundabad is ancient, and it will not let go without a fight." Brock stepped forward, his axe gleaming in the dim light. "Then let's give it the fight it wants. The wrath of the spirit." As soon as Brock raised his axe, the chamber shook once more, this time with greater intensity. The stone altar beneath them cracked, and the ground trembled violently, as if the very mountain was alive with rage. The statues around them groaned, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, and the mist in the air grew thick and oppressive. Suddenly, the spirit's voice boomed throughout the chamber, its power reverberating in the stone like a death knell. "You dare defy me!" the spirit howled. "I am the soul of Gundabad, the eternal forge. You will fall before my wrath." The air was thick with dark magic, and the very stone seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. The statues, now animated, began to move, their stony limbs creaking as they came to life. With each movement, they brought forth torrents of dark energy, hurling blasts of flame and shadow at the dwarves. Brock roared, charging forward into the fray. His axe cleaved through the stone statues with ease, but the power of the spirit regenerated them faster than he could strike them down. The undead warriors' hollow eyes glowed with hatred as they fought on, relentless in their assault. "Focus on the altar!" Thrain shouted over the chaos, his voice full of authority. "The stone must be destroyed. We have no other choice." The relentless struggle. The dwarves fought valiantly, but the odds were against them. Every strike they landed against the statues seemed to heal almost immediately, and the spirit's power only grew stronger with every passing moment. Thrain was beginning to realize that brute force alone would not be enough. He had to find a way to sever the connection between the spirit and the lost stone. "Dromar!" Thrain shouted, his eyes never leaving the altar. "You must place the stone on the altar. We need to channel the energy. It's the only way." Dromar hesitated, clutching the stone tightly to his chest as if it were his last lifeline. The very idea of placing it near the altar filled him with dread, for he knew the stone's dark magic had a hold on him. He could feel the power within it, whispering to him, tempting him with promises of strength and immortality. But the spirit's voice, seething with rage, broke through his hesitation. "Do not listen to him, boy. Place the stone here, and you will become one with me. Together, we will rule this forsaken place." Dromar's heart raced as he turned to Thrain, who stood his ground despite the onslaught of attacks from the statues. "Trust me, Dromar," Thrain urged. "It's the only way to stop this madness." With a deep breath, Dromar made his decision. He bolted forward, dodging the stone warrior's attacks, his heart pounding in his chest. With every step, the power of the lost stone grew stronger, like a magnetic pull trying to drag him into the altar. As he reached the center of the chamber, he placed the stone on the altar, his fingers trembling as the stone began to glow brightly. A blast of light erupted from the altar, and the air crackled with energy. The ground trembled violently as the power of the lost stone merged with the spirit's essence. The shattering of the mountain. The moment Dromar placed the lost stone upon the altar, the entire chamber erupted in a cataclysmic explosion of light and sound. The statues crumbled to dust, and the mist began to dissipate. The eerie glow of the stone grew blinding, and the dwarves had to shield their eyes from the intensity of the light. The voice of the spirit howled in anguish, echoing through the mountains. "No, this cannot be. I will not fade. I am Gundabad. I am eternal." But the spirit's cry was drowned out by the deafening roar of the forge's fire as the power of the lost stone began to consume it. The ground cracked and split open beneath their feet, and the very mountain seemed to shudder as the force of the stone's magic ripped through the heart of Gundabad. Thrain and Brock held their ground, watching in awe as the power of the altar and the stone tore the spirit from its bonds. The entire mountain seemed to be coming alive, its ancient stone bowing and cracking as though in agony. Then, in a final cataclysmic blast, the light from the altar erupted in every direction, tearing through the stone and setting the entire chamber ablaze with the energy of the lost stone. The dwarves were thrown backward by the force of the explosion, and the ground beneath them cracked open. Aftermath, silence and rebirth. When the light finally faded and the mountain's tremors subsided, there was an eerie silence. The dwarves slowly rose to their feet, their eyes adjusting to the dim light that remained. The once thick mist had vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The statues of the kings no longer glowed with malevolent light. The spirit of Gundabad, its curse broken, was no more. The forge, the source of the mountain's dark power, had been extinguished. The lost stone, its power spent, lay dormant on the altar, its glow fading into nothingness. Thrain Copperfist stood silently, his eyes surveying the ruins of Gundabad. The battle had been long, and the price had been high, but they had succeeded. Gundabad, once a mountain of darkness and corruption, now lay at peace. Brock Stonehelm placed a hand on Thrain's shoulder. "We did it, Thrain. Gundabad is free." Thrain nodded, a sense of weary triumph in his eyes. "Yes, but the cost was great. Too many lives were lost. We must rebuild, but we must never forget the lessons of this place." Dromar stood beside them, looking down at the lost stone. "What will happen to it now?" "We leave it here," Thrain said firmly. "Its power is too dangerous. Let it remain buried beneath the mountain, where it can never corrupt another soul." With that, the dwarves began their journey out of the heart of Gundabad, leaving behind the cursed remnants of an ancient power. The mountain, though scarred, had been saved, and so they returned to their kin, carrying with them not only tales of victory, but the hard-earned wisdom that even the mightiest of forges can fall if built upon a foundation of darkness. Conclusion of Chapter 8, The Battle of the Lost Stone. The battle for Gundabad was a turning point in the dwarves' quest to reclaim their lost heritage. By destroying the lost stone and severing the spirit's hold, they freed the mountain from its ancient curse. But the cost was high, and the dwarves knew that their struggle was far from over. They had triumphed, but they had also learned that the legacy of Gundabad, its power, its treasures, and its dangers, was far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 8. The Battle of the Lost Stone marks a major victory for the dwarves, but the struggle for Gundabad's soul has changed them forever. Are they ready for the challenges that lie ahead? Let me know if you're ready for the next chapter. Chapter 9. The Secrets Beneath Gundabad. The air in the aftermath of the battle was still heavy with the remnants of power. The light from the altar had faded, leaving behind a cold, eerie silence. The dwarves stood at the threshold of the great chamber where the lost stone had been destroyed, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The mountain had been saved from the curse of the spirit, but they knew their journey was far from over. Thrain Copperfist's hand still gripped his warhammer, his knuckles white from the tension of the battle. As the echoes of the mountain's tremors settled, a new question hung in the air. What lay beneath Gundabad? They had destroyed the spirit, but had they truly reached the heart of the mountain? Or had they simply uncovered the first layer of a far deeper and darker secret? Brock Dromar, we've only seen the surface of what Gundabad holds, Thrain said gravely. We've freed it from the curse of the spirit, but I can feel something else beneath us, something old and forgotten, something that the dwarves before us never dared to uncover. Brock Stonehelm, still weary from the battle, met Thrain's gaze. What are you saying, Thrain? More danger beneath us? I fear so, Thrain replied. We've only breached the outer layers of Gundabad's power. The spirit was merely a guardian of something older, far darker. The Whispering Tombs. The dwarves gathered their strength and decided to descend deeper into the mountain, hoping to uncover the truth of the ancient power that had once corrupted it. Their torches flickered in the cold, damp air as they descended into a vast cavern far below the central chamber. The walls were covered in strange runes and carvings, telling a story of power and ruin. It was a history long forgotten, even by the most ancient of dwarven scholars. We're not the first to seek the heart of Gundabad, Dromar whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. Look at these carvings. This is old, older than any of us. The carvings depicted dwarves, their faces twisted in agony, standing before a dark, foreboding doorway. The symbols around the door were unfamiliar, but the feeling they imparted was clear. This was a place of burial, of entombment, a tomb of power, sealed away for a reason. Thrain's voice broke the silence, heavy with realization. This is the true heart of Gundabad, the tomb of the ancient kings and the power they sealed away. These carvings, they tell of a treasure, yes, but also of a curse. The tomb is not a place of rest. It is a prison. Dromar looked at the stone door, its edges worn and cracked with age. What kind of power could they have locked away here? Not power, Thrain muttered. A being older than even the first of the dwarven kingdoms. A creature of pure darkness, a prisoner of the mountain. The key to the prison. The dwarves continued deeper into the cavern, where the temperature dropped dramatically. Their breath clouded in the air, and the oppressive feeling that had begun in the central chamber grew heavier with every step. The path led them to a grand stone doorway, adorned with the same symbols as those on the wall. It was a door that had not been opened in centuries. We've reached it, Thrain said, his voice tight with apprehension. The tomb is here. Brock raised an eyebrow, his axe ready. I've heard of cursed places before, Thrain. But this doesn't feel right. We should turn back. Whatever's behind this door isn't something we can fight. We've come too far to turn back now, Thrain said, eyes narrowed. The answers we seek lie beyond this door. With a deep breath, Thrain placed his hand on the stone, pressing against it with all his strength. The door resisted at first, its weight seemingly too great to budge. But then, as if reacting to some ancient power, the stone creaked and groaned, slowly giving way. The dwarves stepped into the chamber beyond. The room was vast, far larger than any of the others they had passed through. In the center of the room stood a massive stone sarcophagus, surrounded by twisted iron chains that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air hummed with an ancient magic that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. "This is it," Thrain whispered. "The prison." But the moment he spoke those words, a deep rumble reverberated through the chamber. The chains around the sarcophagus rattled violently, and the stone lid of the coffin began to shift, as if disturbed by the presence of the dwarves. "No," Thrain said, dread filling his voice. "We've awoken it." The awakening. As the lid of the sarcophagus moved, the air grew heavy with dark energy. The chains around the tomb began to break and shatter, their iron links bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The dwarves stepped back, their weapons raised, but it was clear they were facing something beyond their understanding. A deep guttural voice echoed from within the sarcophagus, filled with an ancient hatred and malice. "At last I am free." The voice sent chills down the dwarves' spines. Thrain felt the weight of it, as though it had been buried in the earth for millennia, only to be awakened by their presence. The chains shattered, and the sarcophagus lid finally slid open. Inside was not a corpse, but a figure. A being of shadow, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. It was ancient, its eyes glowing with the cold fire of the void. Its voice was a rasping whisper, but it carried the weight of ages. "I am the last king of Gundabad," the figure declared. "I am the one who sealed away the power that could destroy this world. And now I will rise again. The last king." The figure stepped from the sarcophagus, its shadowy form coiling around itself like a serpent. The dwarves stood frozen, not knowing whether to fight or flee. This was no ordinary being. It was a king, once mighty and powerful, who had been cursed to lie in prison for all eternity. Thrain stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with fear. "You are the one who corrupted Gundabad. You sealed away the power, but you also cursed the mountain. Why? What is this power you speak of?" The king's glowing eyes fixed on Thrain, his smile cold and mocking. "I sought to save Gundabad from its destruction. I sealed away the dark force that lurked beneath this mountain, the force that even I could not control. But in doing so, I doomed my people to an eternity of torment, for the curse that I placed upon this mountain was never meant to be broken. And now, you have freed me." Brock gripped his axe tighter, his face dark with anger. "We freed you? We had no choice. "I had a choice," the last king interrupted, his voice growing cold and distant. "But I see now that you do not. You will be my heirs, just as I am the heir to the darkness of Gundabad." The true enemy. The figure's shadowy form began to twist and writhe, growing larger and darker with every moment. The temperature in the chamber dropped to freezing, and the dwarves' breath came in visible gasps. Thrain felt the weight of the dark power pressing in on him. We've made a mistake. We've unleashed something far worse than the spirit. This is not just a king. This is the force that has cursed Gundabad for all time. The king's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the mountain. Yes, you are right. I am the force. I am the one who cursed Gundabad to eternal suffering. With those words, the true horror of Gundabad was revealed. Not a curse placed by an enemy, but by one of their own. A king who had tried to control the power beneath the mountain, but had ultimately been consumed by it. Conclusion of Chapter 9. The Secrets Beneath Gundabad. The last king of Gundabad had been awakened, and the dwarves were now facing the true power that had cursed the mountain for ages. A king who had once tried to save his people from destruction, but in doing so, had sealed their fate. Now, the dwarves stood at the precipice of an even greater battle, not just against a corrupted king, but against the very darkness that had torn apart Gundabad. What would the dwarves do now that they had unlocked the deepest secret of Gundabad? Would they defeat the last king, or would they become his new heirs? Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The chamber was thick with tension, and the very air seemed to hum with the ancient power now rising from the depths. The last king of Gundabad stood before the dwarves, a wraith-like figure of shadow and cold fire, his eyes burning with the fire of ancient hatred. His form flickered and shifted, an ever-present reminder that this being was not simply a king, but something far darker, something born from the cursed power of Gundabad itself. Thrain Copperfist gripped his warhammer, his eyes fixed on the king, knowing the true battle was about to begin. Brock Stonehelm stood beside him, his axe raised, prepared to face whatever lay ahead. Dromar, the youngest among them, was still holding the lost stone, its glow now a dim, fading echo of the power it once held. But Dromar's eyes were full of determination. They had come too far to retreat now. "Do you think you can defeat me?" The last king's voice was like the whisper of wind through dead trees, cold and empty. "You, mere dwarves, who stumbled into a power you cannot comprehend." Thrain's voice cut through the dark, strong and resolute. "We have already defeated you once, King. We will do it again." The awakening of the mountain's power. As soon as Thrain spoke those words, the entire chamber seemed to come alive. The stone beneath their feet cracked, and the mountain groaned as if it were waking from a long slumber. The shadows that surrounded the last king grew darker and more intense, coiling around him like a living thing, a manifestation of the curse that had bound him to this mountain. The dwarves braced themselves for what was to come. Thrain knew that no matter how powerful the last king was, the only way to defeat him was to break the curse. The very curse that had kept him alive, twisted by the dark power of Gundabad. "You cannot destroy me," the last king sneered, his voice echoing through the cavern. "I am the mountain itself. My power is woven into every stone, every breath of air. You cannot fight that which is eternal." Dromar, whose heart had been racing since they first entered the chamber, looked down at the lost stone in his hand. The stone was dim, yes, but there was still something within it. A spark of power, a lingering connection to the ancient magic that had shaped Gundabad. It was this power that they would need to channel, to sever the king's connection to the mountain and destroy him once and for all. The struggle for control. Thrain stepped forward, his warhammer raised high. "We've learned a lot about this place, King. We know your power is rooted in the mountain, but we also know that the mountain itself can be torn apart, broken, and so can you." The last king laughed, a sound that echoed through the stone like the cry of 1,000 lost souls. You are fools. You cannot break what has been forged in the depths of the earth. This mountain is my prison and my power. You think your hammer and axe will shatter it? Brock Stonehelm advanced, his axe gleaming in the faint light. It's not the mountain we're going to break, King. It's you. The battle began with a roar of fury. The last king sent out a wave of shadow that struck like a tidal wave, knocking the dwarves off their feet. Thrain was the first to recover, swinging his warhammer in a mighty arc, but the shadow blocked his strike with ease, crackling and snapping with malevolent force. Brock, undeterred, rushed forward, his axe cleaving through the air with precision. But the shadowy forms that surrounded the king twisted and reshaped, blocking every strike. The king's laughter rang out, mocking their efforts. "You will never win, dwarves," the king taunted. "I am beyond your reach. I am part of this mountain. I am eternal." But as the battle raged on, Dromar, still holding the lost stone, realized something. The stone, though faint, still pulsed with energy. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a conduit, a link between the world of the living and the dark forces that lay beneath the earth. The power within it could not destroy the king directly, but it could sever the connection between the king and Gundabad itself. The last hope. Dromar stepped forward, the lost stone glowing brighter as he raised it above his head. "We need to channel the power," he shouted to the others. "The stone! It's the only way!" Thrain and Brock understood immediately. They pushed forward, closing the distance between themselves and the king. The last king, sensing the danger, roared in fury and summoned more shadows, more darkness to protect himself. But the dwarves pressed on, their hearts set on one goal, to destroy the king's hold over Gundabad. Dromar's heart raced as he felt the power of the lost stone surge within him. He could hear the whispers now, faint and ancient, like the winds of time itself. Place the stone in the heart of the mountain. Let it sever the link. With a desperate cry, Dromar hurled the stone toward the altar that still stood at the center of the chamber, the dark magic gathering around it like a living thing. The moment the stone touched the altar, a blinding light erupted from it, more brilliant than any fire or forge. The shadows screamed as they were torn apart by the light, and the king's form began to disintegrate, his screams echoing in the vast chamber. "No!" the king cried as his body began to fade into nothingness. "You cannot! You cannot!" But the power of the stone was too much. The connection was severed. The last king, once a mighty ruler, was reduced to nothing more than ash and echoes. The aftermath. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint crackling of the altar's dying light. The dwarves stood in awe and exhaustion, their weapons lowered, their bodies battered but victorious. Thrain Copperfist wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes weary but relieved. "It's over," he whispered. "We've freed Gundabad." Brock Stonehelm let out a deep breath, his hand still on the handle of his axe. "Aye, it's over. But what a price we've paid. We came here to reclaim our heritage, and instead we uncovered a darkness that nearly destroyed us all." Dromar stood by the altar, his heart heavy with the weight of the journey they had completed. The lost stone, now dim and lifeless, lay at his feet. It had served its purpose, but its power was gone. He could feel it. He had not only helped destroy the king, but had also broken the curse that had haunted Gundabad for so long. The mountain was silent, peaceful at last. Conclusion of Chapter 10. The final confrontation. The battle for Gundabad had reached its conclusion. The dwarves had freed the mountain from the curse that had haunted it for ages, and in doing so, they had destroyed the last remnants of its ancient darkness. The last king, a twisted figure who had once sought to protect his people, had become the very thing that threatened their existence. But the dwarves, through sheer determination and sacrifice, had defeated him, severing his hold on the mountain and ensuring that Gundabad would never again fall into darkness. With the curse broken, the dwarves stood victorious, but the cost of their victory was not forgotten. They had learned the true price of reclaiming Gundabad, and they understood that the past could never truly be erased. But at least now, the mountain was free. And so, with the echoes of the last king fading into the past, the dwarves left Gundabad behind, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for now, they had earned their rest. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Middle-earth, in Tales from Middle-earth, the Lord of the Rings. We've just witnessed the epic final confrontation deep within the cursed halls of Gundabad, where the dwarves faced a darkness older than the mountain itself. The last king has been defeated, and Gundabad is free at last, but there's still so much more to uncover. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of the dwarves' journey? Do you think they made the right decision in the end? Or is there something more to the secrets of Gundabad that still needs to be uncovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your theories and reflections. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on another adventure. There's so much more coming from the rich world of Middle-earth. Tales from Middle-earth will continue to bring you the stories, the history, and the magic that make Tolkien's world so captivating. Now take a deep breath and relax. Let the soothing sounds of Middle-earth calm your mind and drift off into peaceful dreams as we end this tale. Until next time, may your dreams be as rich and adventurous as the stories we share here. Subscribe, comment, and relax. We'll be back with more adventures soon.